Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here on this absolutely gorgeous day. So it's a bit of a shame we're inside, but at the same time, I'm sure there'll be much food for thought and might hopefully open some windows of the mind, as it were. So we're to begin with. I'd just like to say that our co-founder, Dharma Alliance's co-founder Juan Diaz, he's unfortunately not here, and the reason being because he sadly lost his mother, so we had to rush back to the States. So I'd like all of you to just spare some thoughts for him and his family, and for everyone there. So he's here, of course, with us in spirit. We'll be coming back soon, and he'll be taking on the mantle as usual quite soon. But there's this thought as old and good friends of Dharma Alliance, something I wanted to share with all of you. We are now, of course, here in Geneva. We are, the energy is quite interesting these days. There's a lot of intensity. There's a lot of despair. There's a lot of doom and gloom. Many of the events of the recent months seem to have, really put a lot of things out of filter. People are struggling to figure out what's going on, trying to make sense of what's going on. And so we thought it would be very interesting to have a lecture on this particular theme, how to make sense of it all through a dharmic lens. Dharmic approaches and traditions really give frameworks which can really help us understand very complex processes in manners in which we can apprehend them, make sense of them, and act upon them. So we thought it would be very appropriate to have this lecture here, which is called Channeling the Churn. And what we will do for this lecture is we will do a bit of a relay introduction. I'm going to introduce the introducer, if you will, and we are very also apart from the speaker who will be introduced very soon. But we also were very lucky and fortunate to have Professor Jean-Patrick Villeneuve, who's at the University of Lugano, and he very kindly said, and he was very kind enough to come and join us in this lecture and be a part of this discussion. And we really want to see this as a discussion and the beginning of a discussion about making sense of the world as it is right now. I'll introduce Professor Jean-Patrick Villeneuve first, and then I'll hand the mantle over to him so that he will be able to, he will then be introducing the speakers who they're coming up with. Professor Jean-Patrick Villeneuve is a full professor of public administration and management at the Università della Svizzera Italiana. I hope I got the accent correct, in Switzerland, in Lugano. He is director of the Institute of Communication and Public Policy and head of the Public Integrity Research Group as well. His research focuses on issues of anti-corruption, transparency, civic participation, and accountability in global affairs. Professor Villeneuve is particularly interested in the limitations, difficulties, and impacts of implementing these governance initiatives. So, he really knows what we are going to be talking about. He, of course, also knows what he's talking about. So we'll all together hopefully find something together. And his research, of course, has been supported by various institutions, including the European Science Foundation, Swiss National Science Foundation, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. He is originally from Canada, from Quebec, in fact, and one of his, I don't know whether I should call it a secret or not, but what really makes his perspective particularly important and useful for us to navigate this context is that he has also been a part of Canadian politics in the past himself. So before joining academia, he was very much a very active member of political parties in Canada, and that really will help us and help us understand some of these processes better from a very practicing perspective. So he, of course, is published widely, and he has in top-level academic journals and advises numerous organizations at both the national and international levels, which is the reason why he was in Geneva in the first instance, because he was engaging with some of the multilateral institutions there as a part of his research. So, Professor Jean-Patrick Villeneuve, please do the honors and introduce the speaker.
Thank you very much, dear friend Prashant. Welcome, everyone. As we've said, with such a beautiful sun, it is fantastic to have all of you here for this, I think, very important discussion. Thank you for the invitation on this. I've been in the circles of these discussions launching the Dharma Alliance from the start. And it's always a fascinating perspective and a great opportunity to do the types of conversations that are unfortunately not happening anywhere else. So um, it's a unique place, un endroit particulier, to have these types of conversations here under the guidance of Prashant and some of the other co-founders with us. So what are we doing this afternoon? We'll be doing something quite specific. They've heard used the word really. Suraya Kanigaonkar is with us this afternoon. Of course, on a number of topics, we have several voices out there, online, in print, conversations and discussions. But there's a number of elements that makes him the perfect speaker for this. He's a commodities trader. This is not starting well. Commodities trader. Based in Zug. This is getting more and more fishy. Focusing on natural resources, global trade, international relations, economic security. Definitely topics that have been always front page news. You were saying the past few months, weeks, I'd say the past few hours. This has been at the core of the global conversation. An interest in the Dharmic tradition, of course, which is a particular lens we have for this conference series. He's developed on this basis numerous contributions, touching on the future of the planet, geostrategic elements. There's a number of contributions, notably taking that lens to talk about Ukraine and the reality of the biggest war we've had in Europe since the Second World War. How do you get to be a trader in Zug is, of course, not by finishing the elementary school and then jumping onto that. He has a diploma in economics, University of Warwick, and I find it really interesting as an academic to see some of the various programs you get around the world on really specific aspects. And here comes metal and energy finance from Imperial College. So truly an expert that takes this very narrow expertise that we like to have in academia and then put that on the broader scene. In the blood for the conference, talking about the major changes we see happening. Changes that a lot of people have been predicting for several years. Now we seem to be in the middle of it. May you live in interesting times is often a quote attributed to all kinds of people, whether it's a former Indian politician, Chinese or whatnot, but definitely we are in interesting times. And the interest for me of having this forum of conferences is to be able to take one of the lenses that we don't hear enough about, which is the Dharmic tradition. How do we understand better the world using that very particular, very ancient, very sophisticated lens that unfortunately does not peer through, at least the Swiss and European level, the front page news as a key tool to understand the future. And if not to give us the proper answer, maybe allow us to develop better questions in our reflections towards what is coming up. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. Look forward to your presentations. We'll have a presentation about 45 minutes to an hour, then question and answer, and then question and answer around, of course, tea, with finishing with a great tradition. So I leave you the floor.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. Really appreciate it. Thank you. I'm glad to be here, and I think we're living in interesting times, and we probably need to start with understanding how the world is actually changing today. And I'd like to go into the first slide of this, where just want to cover just 4 bullet and how we should impose perhaps restraint by our own, using our own free will to create a more sustainable future. From an individual's point of view, we're talking about liberation from the cycle of life and death, but it's a very Dharmic specific concept, which obviously does not necessarily expand onto the international relations scene. But I think that an element of spirituality is there in everybody. That people look for purpose, and this has been one of the major purposes for people in the Indian subcontinent, at least, and beyond. These are universal principles. So people have found that the state needs to protect them and give them the best opportunity to maximize all of these. That is really the job of the state and the job of people who are administrators. You give people maximum opportunity to make money, to give money, to enjoy their life, to experience pleasure, and also reach that level of spiritual sustenance and fulfillment. Now, we can go on to the next slide here. When there are a lot of things that we can continue talking about on this. The current structure of the economy is based primarily on utility maximization. The idea that you maximize your utility, which is equated in many ways to consumption maximization. You have to consume as much as possible. You have to gain the resources and purchase. And when you buy and when you consume more, there's more production. The people who are producing make more money. They make more products. They make more money. And as a result of that, there's economic activity that's generated, right? And there are many financial systems undergirding this. You have your debt markets and your capital markets. You have it's extremely complex, but this is right now backed by a global security guarantor. In a unipolar world where that country runs a trade deficit and also the reserve currency. This reserve currency is not asset backed. It can be printed at will, and we have seen over several years a massive depreciation in the purchasing power of this reserve currency. Because all currencies are somehow linked to this currency, we end up seeing large devaluations of purchasing power across the world, but also massive inflation in asset values. So you see real estate, you see gold, you see many assets which people hold for long periods of time. Those have increased tremendously in value. The world typically lends to this leader and finances its expenditure. To a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent. Global trade there's a trade-off here. Global trade is expanded because you have the largest consumer that is offering the world a reserve currency and is giving other countries the opportunity to exploit comparative advantages, labor arbitrage, for example, and essentially move cheap products from one country to another and sell it at a profit, and they generate economic value. Global supply chains get integrated, and this is kind of how the world has been working since the post-war period, and incrementally got more and more interconnected over time. And accelerated in many ways since the unipolar moment after the fall of the Soviet Union, and now we are at another inflection point. So, going on to the next slide. There have been many benefits of this. Assuming borrowing is kept in check on a national level, your ability to print money smooths economic volatility. You can manage your economic cycles much more easily. When you borrow money, it allows you to find it on a large scale. It allows money to find its way into capital markets. We've seen this with large companies, for example, in the United States, which have been able to invest heavily in technological innovation. High productivity industries have gained this ability to have long runways so that they can They can try out their products, their innovative products, and get them up to speed, and eventually come up with final products which fundamentally change how the world operates. And this is what technological innovation has eventually has done for us. It is improved productivity, efficiency, output, and also the diversity of goods and services that we can consume, right? Moreover, the global reach of these companies, and it creates a network of dependencies. We all end up using these same big tech products, for example, and there's a lot of bargaining power that comes with this. In the previous era, it was many of the major energy companies that had physical footprints around the world that had this sort of leverage. Now it's a mix of that and tech companies. But it has provided a net benefit to a lot of people. They've been using these products, making new products on top of it in many parts of the world. We've also seen specialization. It improves the economies of other countries, which sell their products to the net importer, and it raises growth. It's reduced poverty to a large extent in countries that were able to manage their economies well. And most importantly, I'd like to talk about this here, which is labor arbitrage for the last 40 years has really enabled developed economies to import low inflation from your producing economies. So goods came at a very cheap price. Many of the developed economies ended up getting deindustrialized, but offshoring their production to other countries, to the point that these developed economies experienced relatively low inflation. And if you see the borrowing rate for 10-year treasuries, 20-year treasuries, over the last 40 years, they were consistently going down. I mean, you've seen these blips, where there were periods of recession, periods of these business cycles, but broadly speaking, they were consistently declining from the 80s. And we see that there was a major change in this trend post-COVID. It started actually not immediately after COVID, but when we saw that inflation shock, central banks had to raise their interest rates, and it broke out of this multi-decade trend. There was something that fundamentally changed in the world. This ability that central banks had for many years to keep interest rates low was extremely important for creating new industries, especially in the services sector. I don't think that era of extremely low interest rates is coming back unless there's a fundamental change to how global trade works. And I think in some ways we're seeing that change unfolding in front of our eyes at the moment. At least it's being forced, it actually changes or not. But this has been probably the perfect example of what neoliberalism has done, and we have not actually seen, frankly, anything like this in the last several centuries. This sort of offshoring of production and complete imbalance in an economy where you usually have a section of society engaged in agriculture, industry, and services, and that has completely gone out of whack because we have integrated the world in many ways. But when the plug gets pulled on that, there's a lot of disruption, and in fact, the chaos that we're seeing today is largely a function of this. I'd like to go on to the next. Going to the benefits. If you look at a very long-term horizon, we've seen GDP per capita in countries that industrialize very fast, obviously take off. But we do notice now that some of these countries and some of these places like Western Europe, parts of East Asia, Latin America as well, we're seeing declining, TFR has been declining. So essentially, these countries, which still have extremely low per capita GDPs and have not benefited as much from this massive change in this massive exponential growth in per capita GDP, we'll see massive inequality in the world because they do not have access to technology to the same extent. They don't have access to financial capital to the same extent as the wealthier countries. And we are now flatlining here in some of the Western countries as well. We're seeing per capita GDP kind of just flatline, and it's going to cause major political problems as well. And if the countries which are on the lower end of the spectrum, if they are also not able to lift their per capita income, you will end up seeing political problems there as well. So it means that the system has worked up to a point, but it has not necessarily delivered the sort of returns that are probably necessary for the 21st century. So this has to change, and it will change. And I'd like to go to the next slide from here. There are costs. For example, easy access to credit, coupled with the culture of consumption maximization, often leads to personal indebtedness. You see this in some countries which have a credit card culture. On a national level, this actually holds true as well. And there is now a concerted effort to reduce national debt, at least in some countries where they can. Moral hazard is another issue. It creeps into both fiscal and monetary policy. Wasteful expenditures just pile one on top of the other. And we've also seen, and there's academic literature to support this, that throughout all these interest rate cycles that have taken place over the last several decades, especially by the Federal Reserve, it has disproportionately benefited the rich more than the poor, because it has essentially helped those with assets to make more money, and the ones who are not able to get onto that ladder have really been left behind. Although we have seen overall standards of living improve, doesn't mean that inequality has not. And when you look at countries that have been based on this, their foundational principles are that you can have, say, the American dream. You can come here and build a life for yourself and reach the maximum. Social mobility gets completely distorted because of something like this in the long run. So, as I mentioned, asset-rich individuals benefit more than asset-light ones, and increased inequality breeds social and political tensions. And I think we've seen this. We've seen this play out in elections, in parts in Europe and in the United States as well. There's a pushback, and that pushback is becoming more and more pronounced. And until you get to a point where the elected governments make a decision that they have to change things. And if they don't change it, then then people will elect another government with the hope that they will also change it. If they're not able to change it, then over several cycles, you end up having chaos. And that's something which we all want to avoid. I'd like to go to the next slide, please. So weaknesses of the current system. So here, I've also talked quite a bit about the weaknesses. Neoliberalism with unipolarity. It allows your country with the reserve currency to borrow, it finances growth, and a vast military, which is supposed to help this country become the security guarantor for large parts of the world that integrate into its sphere of influence. It also enables the state to exert control over the economic policies to some extent of smaller nations. And this system actually works until it's unchallenged. So you would look at, say, the 1990s up until the early mid-2000s. It worked. And then you started seeing it slowly face some problems. If you have debt-fueled growth, where your trade deficit is very large with a geopolitical and ideological rival, then the system actually falls apart because somebody is going to pull the plug at some point. Importantly, a part of this neoliberal project, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, was this doubling down on demanding ideological purity from countries that are on the margins, for example, of the Western sphere of influence. The idea that democracy and free trade have to be coupled, and they're intrinsically linked, without which you cannot really be considered a country which is on the path towards development. It's proven to be a failed strategy because we have seen countries that do not subscribe to democratic principles end up benefiting the most from engagement with the world's most powerful democracy. And we have seen the subversion of free trade on an industrial scale, which has ultimately, in many ways, denied smaller countries in the global south, especially today, the ability to diversify their economies and actually move away from, say, agriculture to industry or from industry to services. They have not been able to do this because you've seen the subversion of free trade. And that subversion of free trade was allowed because rather in the hope that that these producing countries will end up becoming democratic. And it never happened. So now the democracies have to change because the other side's not going to change. So now I'd like to go on to the next slide, please. So the system is unraveling. So we're now, and we actually entered a long period of deglobalization since COVID. Supply chain resilience became extremely important. It became very apparent. And we've been gradually moving towards decoupling from various sources of production and trying to create new supply chains. And we're not in a period of reglobalization. We're really in a period of decoupling and countries hunkering down. Trust in multilateral institutions, which were at the foundation of actually facilitating dialogue to make sure that this neoliberal system expands and deepens. The trust in these institutions are waning. It's waning. So, and this trend is becoming more pronounced. And I would say that if you go back a few years, the two most seminal events that changed the course of trust in multilateral institutions was first when China was admitted into the WTO in 2001, and when the United States chose to invade Iraq without adequate evidence of weapons of mass destruction. So we ended up having the rug getting pulled under the multilateral institutions, and they continued operating because they have to. But it was a brazen subversion of these institutions by major parties involved. And I think that we've never recovered from that. The strategic imperative today is for an economic policy and foreign policy reset. And it's being driven by great power competition. And essentially going back to the point in my previous slide, this idea that you can proselytize a one-size-fits-all Western liberal democratic system that countries must aspire to become like or emulate. I think that has run its course. It's unsustainable. And we all know now that each country will have its own voice. Whether it's listened to or not, they will try to express themselves in the way they can. And that's what the process of emerging multipolarity is really about. It's not an easy process. We will end up with a new equilibrium in the future. But when you depart from an established worldview, from the North Atlantic most dominantly, it's bound to create disruptions. So I'd like to go on to the next slide, please. So this, I'm very happy to show this Dharmic framework, in fact, by Mr. Krishna Kumar and Mr. Sriram Balasubramaniam, because, and I'd like everyone here to have a chance to speak to them about this, because this is from a working paper of theirs, and how they look at SDGs in the context of Dharma. When we look at all these major changes that are happening around us, we need to refocus on some of the basic concepts which can guide us towards a more sustainable future. And it comes down to the values espoused within the Dharmic framework. We talk about honesty and truthfulness. We talk about what this really means for for example, dignity and respect for all. Dignity and respect is actually missing in a world where trust is absent, or rather eroding. When we look at it in terms of, for example, transparency and a corruption-free society, that's kind of where we want to go to. That ends up reducing poverty, and it provides good work, and it reduces inequalities. Each one of these, and I can always go back to this slide later, I think you can connect a dharmic principle to a potential path, a potential action which can create results which are linked to the SDG goals. So, which are linked to sustainable development goals. So I'd like to go on to the next slide and visit this one again. I'd like to focus on some of the challenges that need to be addressed over the longer term, but I'm going to work from individual to societal, national, and international challenges. Going back to the issue of consumption and production maximization, it disregards sustainability as it stands in general. Consumption without any sort of self-restraint, it's been sold as freedom. We must keep consuming, and that we should have all the possible options available to us, and only if we do that, we are free, democratic, and we actually are allowed to express ourselves in the fullest. So individualism has now provided the easiest path to acquiring those financial resources for us to consume. Inflation, as I mentioned before, in the value of assets and primarily real estate, has outpaced wage growth. And a house, for example, in the early 1990s was maybe 3 times a person's wage, average person's wage. And again, it varies from country to country. Now it's anywhere between 6 to 8 times in some countries. Today in the United Kingdom, the median age of a homeowner is north of 50. It's around 57. First-time homeowner. It's shocking. We would not expect that the new houses that are being purchased, the median age of the buyer is 57. This was around 32 in the 1980s, early 1980s. It rose to around 35, 36 in the early 1990s. It went up to around 42-ish, if I'm not mistaken, by the early 2000s or mid 2000s. And then it started accelerating very fast. And by like 2015, it was like 47, and then it ramped up very quickly. So now this means that there is massive inflation, and clearly wages have not caught up. This is also partly because of technological improvements and changing productivity to the point that people's labor is worth less and less every single year. In some ways, because this is generally what ends up reducing real wage growth in some ways. But this is a major problem, which is affecting large parts of the developed world. Those outside, especially the top 10% of earners. Another major problem that we're seeing is the coupling. For example, people getting married, having children is reduced. It's falling off a cliff. TFR globally is declining, and it's declining at a rapid rate. And this is eventually, over the next 3-4 decades, is going to lead to major changes in this consumption-based growth model that we have. So you can see imbalance is pretty much everywhere. Going back to the original point that I mentioned about Dharma is what keeps things in balance, we don't see any balance out here. Everything is getting imbalanced. We are also seeing technological changes which are fundamentally altering how we interact with one another, between us and our phones, our computers, and also each other, right? This has markedly increased isolation, mental health issues, especially amongst teenagers. You see like anywhere between 40 to 50% of teenage girls are now facing some form of mental health issues in the United States. This is just one example. Reduced attention spans. We're seeing children unable to absorb new information at the sort of rate at which we were able to many years ago, compared to that. So we're seeing a mental degradation happening alongside this massive change in technological innovation. And when this happens on a mass scale, you're seeing greater susceptibility to propaganda. It's not just for young people, it's just for people who are adults as well. And this actually has a social impact, political and social impact. And the reality is that as humans, we have never had to adapt this kind of technological change throughout the history of our evolution since Lucy was found in East Africa 2 million years ago, we're roaming the earth that many years ago, to now we've consistently we barely grew our technological innovation in the beginning, and then it started accelerating, and now it's gone to exponential rates in the last 15 to 20 years. So an artificial intelligence is fundamentally going to change how we perceive our use in the world, and how governments see people, and how they view these people who are citizens of their country. How do they view them as really potential agents of value and consumption of change, or are we going to outsource much more to a superior intelligence platform, which is kind of what AI is going to provide us? So we're already toying with the idea of universal basic income, and the question then is, how are we going to value money? So a lot of changes are going to take place, but it's probably a bit too early for it right now, but we're pushing towards this direction. So these are some of the individual changes. I'd like to go on to the next slide. Societal changes. So we saw this K-shaped economic recovery. It was in the news before, during COVID actually. People were expecting us to have this K-shaped economic recovery. Then once it actually happened, we barely saw it in the news. Reality is that we've seen an increase in inequality since COVID ended, largely because of monetary policy, which was probably misplaced at the time. We've seen, again, falling TFRs driven by rising cost of living. This is changing the way societies and communities look. We're also seeing migration pressures. So that's also sometimes to backfill for lost people in certain parts of the world, for example, here in Europe. But it's also a natural tendency for high TFR locations, which are unstable, to end up having its people move to relatively stable, economically, financially prosperous and stable regions where TFRs are declining, where there's an incentive to move people across, either for political purposes, where these individuals can end up voting for certain political parties, or also supposedly for improving the consumption demographics. Now, this is a major issue because it causes social friction in society, and something which, again, is sometimes amplified by social media, or sometimes it's necessary to get these narratives out there. Both are becoming issues which polarize society. We're also finding a major problem, which is, and I mentioned this earlier, which is the inability of some developed economies to find new areas of growth. How can a country which is deindustrialized, which has maxed out its per capita income essentially from whatever it's providing, mostly services and anything high tech, they're not able to grow their per capita income. We've seen this with Korea, we've seen this with Japan. Now we're starting to see this with Europe. And countries which are used to this infinite progress, where every year they're supposed to consistently generate more and consume more, produce more, become richer, they are leveling off. And when they level off, there are social issues that start getting generated in these societies. When you look at technological changes and how it affects societies in general, reduced social interaction, which is a major problem today. It's increased the atomization in society, where people just kind of stay in their own locations. They communicate mostly through virtual means. And we're also seeing the impact through reduced coupling and falling TFR. And as a result, you're seeing a breakdown in traditional family values and traditional family setups. some of these family setups were naturally going to change because you were seeing people move from rural areas to urban areas. This was a natural way that society would move. But the speed at which it's changing is now largely a function of technological changes and how that's affecting our behavior. I mentioned about higher proclivity to absorb and believe disinformation. And this ends up giving space within countries for foreign actors, sometimes malign foreign actors, to come in and disrupt societies. And we're seeing this. We're seeing this actually happening in ways which we can never officially see because we don't know who's behind, for example, the bots on social media that are shaping the way that we think. But this is happening. Weaker community networks because of the atomization of society. It ultimately doesn't give a social net. We talk about social security, where the government provides a social security net. We don't see this now where the community actually takes care of people that are falling behind. This used to be how societies used to work to some extent. The state plays its role, but then the community also plays its role. And when this fails and the state is unable to find new avenues of growth, it has less resources, has less money, then the weaker sections of society feel extremely vulnerable. And then they express themselves in whichever way they can. And you see this sometimes through elections, sometimes through protests. And then if none of these work, then you end up seeing bigger problems. You're starting to see this happen in developed economies. The next one is national challenges. So moving from individual to society to nation. So the same sort of lack of trust that's kind of developing on a social level, or rather the atomization of society creates these gaps in communication. On a national level, you're seeing fraying trust between different groups within society. And it's leading to political churn and also sharp swings in electoral outcomes. And this is deeply unsettling in some ways, because we were used to a sort of predictive path that there's some sort of bipartisan consensus, typically in democracies, and you kind of move along a similar sort of path with some changes, whether you're, slightly less tax or more tax, but it just kind of moves along a certain path. But now you're seeing something quite different. That's because governments are unable to solve the structural economic and social problems. And political outfits are relying on polarizing the public, often with the help of social media, mainstream media as well. And then we've seen a general erosion of trust in the media as a consequence of this. And when people feel that the information around them is propaganda, potentially, they become very distrustful of everything that they see, the institutions, the politicians, and this vacuum that's created gets filled by malign actors in some cases. Internal imbalances in a country has a cascading effect on policymaking, and more broadly, how countries engage with one another as well. Because in democratic societies, the impulse from the ground ends up filtering to the top at some point. Maybe not in every election, but at some point it does. What that groundswell of support really does for lifting people into power will end up affecting the way that the leaders of those countries actually behave on the international stage. We're also seeing governments prioritize strategic objectives over purely commercial objectives. We've seen that since COVID, especially. And here, again, coming back to sustainability, here we look at environmental degradation, water stress, food insecurity, energy poverty. There are no energy poor rich countries in the world. Every country needs to get access to energy. But are we finding ways to do that? I mean, we have made major strides in clean energy, but this is still a major problem, especially in the developing world. Debt traps, for example. This is something where countries which are almost undergoing a second wave of colonization are now falling into debt traps and are unable to come out of them. And this poses eventually major risk to social and economic stability. like to go to the next slide, please. International challenges. So tariffs, currency devaluation, which is a response in some cases to tariffs, and a breakdown of the post-war multilateral trading system, emergence of a more bilateral trading system, labor subsidies, industrial subsidies. These have all taken center stage and fairly quickly. Depreciation of the value of the reserve currency, the inherent purchasing power of the reserve currency, also to inflate away debt, does fuel some macroeconomic volatility. We're seeing GDP growth between 1.5% potentially at risk as uncertainty currently prevails. I'm giving the current example of what's happening more recently with the tariff imposition. Institutions are facilitating and fostering international cooperation are rapidly losing their edge because they don't know where to go. They've been working with this intent of bringing countries together and facilitating trade, finding the best practices to be able to pursue this. And they are now losing their edge and will be forced to reform and adapt. Another important point is that we're seeing major security risks, one after another, wars, bushfires, or if you may, or major wars, starting to feed off one another. And it's part of great power competition. We've kind of seen this before, but the world is rearming at the fastest pace since World War II. So the ability to address these problems is not really, we've seen what happened, for example, during the Ukraine war, the UN talked about what happened during the Iraq war. The crisis redressal is simply absent in any real form. It's not there. So it's the law of the jungle. And this is deeply unsettling and worrying. So how can we go about addressing many of these issues? And I'd like to look at a Dharmic framework for dealing with this. The next slide, please. I'd like to start off first with the individual, right? And the way that you can create a more aware society, a society that understands how to balance itself, understand the purusharthas that I mentioned earlier. It starts with educating them, rewiring education to strengthen individual resilience. It's a very long-term project, and I think that there are many efforts that are made to do this, but